One of the most important things we can do in life is to find our voice, the essence of who we are. We do this by listening to people who have found their voices. Because women are fundamentally different from men, women and girls need to hear women's voices. Yet for all the talk that women are big talkers, our voices aren't heard. In late August, the Women's Media Center issued a reporting indicating that during this year's general election period, roughly April to August, only 28% of the articles in the nation's 25 most influential papers were written by women. For those interested in benchmarking, 38% of newsroom reporters are women, while women comprise 51% of the population. I love men. I like working alongside them. I am married to one. I have a 16-year-old son whom I adore. But I personally don't want to live in a world where decisions about who talks, who writes, and what gets reported on are made largely by men. Not only because I want to find my voice, and I want my daughter to find hers, and certainly there is a fairness piece, but as importantly, there is greater depth and magnificence to the narrative, to our narrative as a people, when both the story makers and storytellers are men and women. Anne-Marie Lipinski, the curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalism here at Harvard, is a Pulitzer Prize winner and the former editor of the Chicago Tribune. Ms. Lipinski will be leading the conversation with Jodi Kantor, a New York Times correspondent who began covering politics for the New York Times in 2007. In her best-selling and, may I say, excellent book, The Obamas, Ms. Kantor chronicles the first couple's adjustment to the new world of the White House. Today, on the eve of the 2012 presidential election, she is here to discuss Mrs. Obama's political transformation. It is with great pleasure I introduce you to Jodi Kantor and Anne-Marie Lipinski. Because of their reporting, their imprimatur, their voice, the narrative is shaping up differently, and as a consequence, we are thinking a bit differently about who we are and what we can be.
Thank you, Whitney. Whitney's a new friend of mine. We met over the summer at a journalism conference about money, or lack thereof in journalism. And what I liked about her was how insistent she was throughout the weekend that we all get to work. She was sort of the driving engine behind much of what we did that weekend. And we've since had the chance to talk about some other things. And out of those conversations came this conversation. So I'm very grateful to you for getting this organized along with my colleagues here at Nieman. Welcome to all of you to the Litton House, which is the headquarters of the Nieman Foundation, where we do a lot of things, including run a fellowship program. And many of my fellows in this year's class of 24 are with us here today. So welcome to my fellows as well. And welcome to Jodi, who says a day that she gets out of New York is a good day. I told her those are very low standards, and hopefully we can give her more reasons to be happy here in Cambridge today. But it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you so much.
So the way I'd like to do this is I'll spend some time talking to Jodi about her work and her book, and then we will open it up for conversation with all of you here today. And we've got a little less than 90 minutes together here at this point. So Jodi, one of the things I'd like you to start with is to describe your beat for us. It's not quite that you just cover the White House. It's not quite that you cover politics, but it's a very specific sphere within that larger world that you've carved out for yourself. Could you talk about that?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Whitney, who I met online and yet had the idea for this event. And actually, the Nieman Foundation gave me very early and crucial support in my career. I'm a Harvard Law School dropout. I really thought I wanted to be a lawyer and had an epiphany here in Cambridge that I wanted to be a journalist. And one of the professors at the law school sent me to see Bill Kovach, who told me that even though my clips were so horrible that I didn't want to show them to anybody, this was not a crazy idea, and he let me sit in on a few Nieman sessions, which was an incredibly generous thing to do. for a 22-year-old who had really never worked in proper journalism, but had this idea that she could somehow be a part of it. So it means a lot to me to be here. I would say that most of what I've spent the last 6 years doing is writing about who Barack and Michelle Obama really are and how they are coping with this extremely unusual, exciting, sometimes distressing situation in which they have put themselves. They're not the only people I write about. I've written about everybody from Hillary Clinton to Mitt Romney to Sarah Palin. But the project I keep coming back to again and again at the paper and in the book is saying, okay, let's look at sort of what we know about the Obamas. On the one hand, there's the official White House or campaign version, right, in which they are these fairly perfect human beings who handle everything with grace and wisdom and ease. And then on the other hand, we have the Obama's opponents who will tell you that they are despicable, untrustworthy, aggrieved, irresponsible beings who are trying to ruin the country. And what I'm really trying to do is chart an entirely different course of saying in a fair and honest and sometimes tough way, let's really try to understand these people. By the way, even though they won't talk to us. I mean, I'm lucky enough to have interviewed the Obamas several times in my career. I had a big interview with them in the Oval Office about their marriage in 2009. But one challenge that my colleagues and I have constantly, and that I bet you discuss here a lot, is that one of the central challenges of writing about political figures now is that access is growing smaller and smaller. So in a lot of ways, we operate a lot like biographers of dead people in that we can't really talk to our subjects that much. Although it's almost as if you can't talk to your subjects that much, but you're indirectly hearing their reactions from beyond the grave. Um, but um, but that is the challenge, and getting past, on the one hand, the propaganda, and then on the other hand, the naysayers who don't actually understand the Obamas.
So, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, I want to talk about some of the reaction to the book, both from those who loved it and from those who did not, the reactions from Beyond the Grave. But before we do that, I always think it's interesting. Authors and researchers journalists live with a story sometimes for a very long time, and have in their head a very clear vision and notion of what that story is. And then the story is exposed to fresh air, and everybody else has a view now of what that story is. And I'm wondering if you can try to, remove the reaction you've heard to it and articulate for us what it was you thought that book was before that
Sure.
book was published. It has a title that is both narrow and broadly encompassing. The Obamas obviously is describing two or potentially four very specific people. Um, and so it's narrow in that sense, but sort of how you think to shape the definition of the Obamas is another piece of this. And I'm wondering if you could just say, what in your mind this book was about.
Well, that's every author's dream question. So thank you, because I think you're right that a strange thing to watch is other people defining your work for you. And it was especially strong with this book because everybody has an opinion about the Obamas in the book. We're dealing with a polarized political system. We're dealing with a sort of journalistic ecosystem in which a lot of political books are either hagiographies or takedowns. And sometimes when a book is neither, people don't know how to classify it. And the book touches on gender, it touches on race. When it was published, there was a lot of new information in it that the White House didn't necessarily want known. To me, the book is about people who are strangers in a new world. the Obamas worked so hard to become president, first lady, and yet they get to the White House and they find that they're in this alien, foreign environment that, in some ways, is very inimical to who they really are. It's about, in part, how some of the things that were their assets in 2008 in the election became challenges or detriments in the White House. Their newness, their freshness, the feeling that they really were outsiders to Washington, that was part of what made them so exciting in 2008. And yet it became a huge challenge for them in the White House, sometimes in ways that were very personal and intimate, sometimes in ways that we as a nation could watch. And it's also about their marriage. It's not, and I'm sure I disappointed some readers with this, it's not like secrets of the Obama marriage, but it's really about this kind of dialectic between the Obamas that has always existed. Don't be fooled by the presentation of Michelle Obama as, the mere mom in chief, whose job in the White House is mostly looking after her girls. Of course, there's an element of truth and authenticity to that, but this is a Harvard trained lawyer with a powerful critique of the political system and really good reasons for wanting her husband not to be in politics. Far beyond, I want you home for dinner every night, and especially because our president is so elusive and hard to report on, I really found that by following the Michelle Obama line in the administration and understanding her reactions to healthcare reform, Rahm Emanuel as chief of staff, the immigration debate, et cetera, I could understand a lot better what was going on in this presidency.
So, so then the book is published, and there's a wide range of reactions. So I'm just going to read two reactions. One is from a reviewer who liked the book very much, and then a quote from Mrs. Obama from the First Lady. So a reviewer writes, Ms. Kantor retires wooden stereotypes of the political wife as a prop or a problem and explores what it means to be a modern first lady, one with her own opinions and an expectation that she will be heard. The book offers concrete examples of how Mrs. Obama, even as she wrestled with self-doubt, bolstered her husband as only a wife can and kept him grounded in ways that had nothing to do with the very tired story of her ordering him to pick up his dirty socks. So then there was an interview on CBS this morning with Gayle King, and the First Lady reacted this way. I guess it's more interesting to imagine this conflicted situation here and a strong woman, But that's been an image that people have tried to paint of me since the day Barack announced that I'm some angry black woman. How do you think about that reaction, and how do you think about these kind of polarized reactions to this work that you had such a clear view of?
Well, it was a big surprise to me and to other people at the Times as well. Before the book was published, your old partner in crime, Dean Baquet, read it, and we sat down before publication because I really wanted his advice on.
Dean Baquet is the managing editor at the New York Times and someone I used to report stories with.
And so Dean also used to be the Washington bureau chief and is, just has a lot of wisdom in these areas. And I said, how do you think the White House is going to react to this, knowing them as you do? And he said, there's a lot that they're not going to like in this book because, there's a lot of dirty laundry here. There's a lot of conflict and tension that they would rather remain under wraps. But he said, it's not an unflattering portrait. There's no horrible revelation that would be devastating to the president's reelection prospects. You clearly tried hard to be fair. They know exactly who you talk to. And, also as Dean knew, I fact-checked the book with the White House beforehand. And so we thought they would have kind of a muted reaction, like they would just let the book pass. And that's the way a lot of political figures react to books that are published about them. The standard line is kind of, I'm much too busy worrying about the problems of this country to worry about what's written about me. So, the most important thing about Mrs. Obama's reaction is that she said she hadn't read the book. So, it was kind of a curious moment because she was reacting very strongly to something she hadn't read. I don't know if she's read the book to date. But, the most important thing to me was to step back and look at it as a reporter and see what I could learn from it. When you're covering a presidency, there's always a temptation for you to be drawn into the story. And various figures in my Obama reporting have tried to do that with me. Jeremiah Wright picked a giant fight with me, in my probably third month of reporting on the Obamas. He posted this letter on the internet about me saying that I was the new Judith Miller of the New York Times, and that, and that my reporting couldn't be trusted. And that was my first lesson in step back, don't engage. The ethos is always that you're going to cover these people as well and as sensitively and as fairly as you can, no matter what they say about you. So a lot of people turn to me for quotes in the days afterwards, and I always tried to be very careful not to react defensively or critically. I also think it's a lesson for me and um, everybody else in just how hard it is to be written about. I'm very conscious as a profilist that it's extremely discomforting to be profiled. Um, for one story, I'll often call 30 or 40 of somebody's close friends. Michelle Obama, part of what was interesting about Michelle Obama's reaction was that I had reported on her for so long. I had done so many stories. I had interviewed her. And I think that on the one hand, there was a degree of trust. She gave me, I was the first reporter, the first book author to get access to the East Wing, which is her part of the White House. And that's why there are a lot of behind the scenes stories about what happened in the East Wing. But at the same time, I'm sure it was so creepy for her, over all these years to know that I was calling members of her mommy's group. I was calling people who had worked for her, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other thing about her reaction, again, stepping back and looking at it as a reporter, is that this is one of the only unscripted moments she's had as First Lady, and one of the only kind of raw things she said about race, where she's confessed her anxieties and fears. And so, in some weird way, it was a confirmation of part of what I was writing about, the idea that this person was new to public life, that this was much harder for her, that she had let on. And one thing I was very sure about from my reporting is that what she went through in the spring of 2008, do you remember that moment when she was widely accused of being kind of aggrieved or an angry Black woman, and all of a sudden people were very suspicious about her? That had been very personally traumatic for her. She had always been this kind of high achiever and upstanding person her entire life. And to watch the way your public image could suddenly veer out of control, the feeling all of a sudden of like the whole nation is saying something nasty about me and that it could hurt her husband's prospects, that had been really tough for her. And so, in a way, I understood why she was a bit haunted by that.
So I'm going to ask you to read two sections from your book. And I could pick, there were lots of pairings I could have put together. These were just two I chose to demonstrate what I think is this kind of ongoing dysfunction we have as a nation about what we expect out of that person. It's not an office. It's a title only in relation to the fact that the person they married has a title. They're not paid in any real sense of the word, yet there are very, very strict codes about what that person should do. We've seen a variety of models in the last handful of, even the most modern White House has very, very different models. And we've got criticism for them all. And so I thought that that the first section I'm going to ask you to read is a piece where it seems like somebody has it pretty well figured out. And then the second is a section where we're kind of, confronting full bore all of the sort of conflicted obligations and expectations we have as a nation. So in this first piece, this is kind of early in her tenure as the first lady, and she has decided to appear on the cover of Vogue magazine, for which she's gotten some blowback. But this is your describing how this kind of plays into her broader sense of who she is and what she wants to do with her work. So if you could just read that paragraph.
Sure. The First Lady's desire for African American girls to see her on the cover of Vogue was telling. If there was one thing she knew how to do, it was to relate to young people, especially those who were outsiders in one sense or another. In the early months of the administration, as she waded through invitations for speaking engagements, the ones that appealed to her were from groups that were new or upcoming or somehow represented underdogs, the kind that had never been visited by a First Lady before. She had little interest in lending her presence to the powerful and speaking at Ivy League university graduations. Among the events she did in her initial months as First Lady, the mentoring event that had brought prominent women to Washington area schools and then back to the White House was her favorite. Surrounded by a diverse group of high-achieving women and high school girls, she was in her element. Every event we do is with an eye towards opening a door for someone, Melissa Winter, her deputy chief of staff, said. Rather than just give speeches from behind a podium, she and her colleagues looked for opportunities for a First Lady to form some sort of emotional bond with the audience. If Michelle Obama is not going to go out and connect, then we're wasting her, Winter continued. What is special is that she's not aloof, untouchable, unreadable.
And so then in this, and that's a East Wing that has a notion of what this job is, of a first lady who has a notion of what she wants to do with this bully pulpit, and it's strategic, and it seems very clear, and yet that that path sends them into a variety of buzzsaws, including the lack of desire to do some of the more traditional things that have been expected in that role. And so this is just in this next description, you're talking about kind of the way that she is viewed in the most, by the most in the most sort of popular view, what she wears and how she comports in that sense. And so I'm wondering if you can just, I don't know if you want to set it up anymore, but just starting there and going to the bottom of the page.
Um, so this is about the unrelenting scrutiny that Michelle Obama is under. She was picked apart for wearing anything too fancy, like the Lanvin sneakers, but wearing clothes that were too everyday provoked criticism too. Early one summer morning, she had walked Bo, the new family dog, on the White House grounds, dressed the way people dress to walk dogs. Baggy madras shorts, no makeup, bra strap peeking out a little. Someone managed to snap an unofficial photo, and within hours, pictures of her looking slightly unkempt were all over the internet. A few weeks later, when the first family visited the Grand Canyon, they were warned to dress in light clothing because temperatures on the canyon floor could climb dangerously high. Michelle wore a pair of unremarkable looking shorts. Another flurry of pictures hit the web, and Robin Givhan, then the fashion critic of the Washington Post, wrote a column deeming the shorts common. The First Lady approached Robert Gibbs, he was the press secretary, as you remember, afterward, worried and contrite. Had she committed a faux pas? He felt sorry for her, he said later. She was trying so hard and was so concerned about making a mistake. For months, Gibbs had been making the case for the Obamas looking approachable and down to earth. And now that the First Lady had dressed like a regular mom, she was being picked apart for that, too. You're never going to please some of these people, he told her.
So I'm not sure what more I need to say, except I will ask the question whether there's not, a working mom in this room who doesn't, relate in the most visceral way to that, to that tension. And I'm wondering how much of this you don't call this out in any real clear way, but how much is this a story? How much is this a story about us? Kind of as a nation and how we hold that position and think about it, and whether there is, I mean, who is the, who's the titan who could fulfill all of those roles?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The most common reader reaction I've gotten to the book is to say, God, after reading your book, I would never want to be president or first lady. And, there's kind of a question I feel that I'm always asking and never asking in my work, which is, what are we doing to these people in public life? And who is really willing to run for public office given these circumstances? Which is to not to suggest that I am the apologist or protector of these public figures, but I do really want to chronicle how hard it is. I mean, I'll pull up a very recent example. Everybody's talking about how weak Barack Obama's debate performance was last week, and it certainly was. But as an Obama observer, the questions it made me ask were, um, you know, how has Barack Obama really dealt with the stress of the last 8 or 9 years of his life? The guy has been on an unrelenting marathon that few of us could endure with literally no break. Um, what are his own anxieties and insecurities, and how do they affect, his performance? Why did he choke at one of the key moments of his political career? And even though those questions are unanswerable, because he'll never sit down and talk about his own feelings, because um, when you try to ask questions like that of advisors, they inevitably say to you, you're trying to psychologize the president, as if trying to understand him deeply is a terrible, terrible sin. Um, you get these little sort of windows into these people and what they're trying to accomplish. And, both that section and I thought the debate performance were in some ways testaments to the unbelievable pressure that the Obamas are under. The other reason I'm glad you brought that up is that, Whitney, you framed this very much as, a book about a woman by a woman, which I think it is. And I tried to do something in this book which some people totally got and not everybody got, which is to say that things like the First Lady's clothes can be important and serious, especially in a kind of newspaper atmosphere. There's this traditional dichotomy, right, where you either do the hard news reporting on matters of clear substance, or you do the sort of soft stuff, the feature stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And I've found that in the Obama story, one is connected to another, because what happened with Michelle Obama's clothing in this administration is so complicated and such a real story. As the first African American first lady, she wants so badly to change negative stereotypes about what Black women look like. She wants to show that you don't need to be 100 pounds or look like a Barbie doll to be beautiful. And she dresses with incredible care, and she wears fancy, expensive clothing a lot of the time. But then what happened is that Republicans were making an argument about the president and spending, right? And trying to argue that the president was irresponsible with money. And they took Michelle Obama's beautiful clothes and they used them as a target and as part of their argument. So she had to face the choice. She had to navigate, do I dial that back, and wear stuff from Target all the time, which she does sometimes, or do I just go ahead and do this, the way I want to do this, even though the criticism can sometimes hurt my husband's cause. And so it's so important to me to show that some of those little things like clothes, which can be dismissed as a girly thing or a light thing, can give us insight into what's really going on with what the Obamas face.
You have a line in the book where I think you quote somebody from the administration or from the East Wing staff saying, there was some course correction going on, and she was being encouraged to go on talk shows and talk about pantyhose and that she liked bacon and things like that. And the model was the mom from the Cosby Show. And you have a line about how impoverished our views of African American women are, that we had to turn to a 2 decades old fictional television character to find our moorings.
Absolutely. I mean, and the astonishing thing is how much the Obamas have taken on, right? I think that's the fundamental thought I always come back to when I look at these two human beings. I mean, Barack and Michelle Obama are trying to, reverse the trajectory of the American economy, fix various longstanding injustices, in American life, add the list of, 20, 40, 60, 100 more foreign and domestic policy issues. And then on top of it all, they're, um, you know, trying to um, fill this void, and change. I mean, I can't remember if I said this in the book, but at some point writing the book, I said to myself, well, how many famous Black professional women are there? And especially when you strike out entertainment and sports, how many famous Black business women are there? University professors, public intellectuals, politicians, et cetera, et cetera. It's an incredibly small number. And so I do think she's up against all of the usual First Lady challenges and then this extra level that comes from that deficit.
There's something else I want to talk about, and that is this the sort of the ubiquity of coverage, and it's not just from legacy institutions, but I mean, it's certainly an administration that demonstrated during the first campaign its sophistication with social media, but it's a little bit live by the sword, die by the sword. I mean, this ubiquity of coverage, where it's not just a news cycle anymore, but it's literally 24 hours a day, some of it accurate, some of it not. And you describe a president, um, uh, you don't use the word bitter, but close to that about media and his feeling that it just doesn't get him, and why isn't it in the business of kind of correcting errors in a more which used to be called journalism, actually. We now call it fact checking. It's like a whole new mode of business. But it's such a different time in which to be leading a public life than it was even 4 years ago, where Twitter was not the phenomenon it is now. I mean, we certainly had social media, but there's ever more of it. And one of the things in reading the book that I found myself thinking about, just in my own work or things that I read, is how much of what we know about people actually adds up to be about them and who they really are. And we have this mountain of detail and this mountain of observation. And what does it really tell us in the end? And then I was, in getting ready for this, I was reading David Remnick's review of your book in the New Yorker, and I want to give you a chance to respond to this. He's describing a scene in the White House where the aforementioned Mr. Gibbs, the press secretary, is having an argument with Valerie Jarrett about the way the First Lady reacted to his work on a particular story. And Remnick writes, Kantor nails her story. She had 6 sources in the room and casts it all in the stock lexicon of DC confrontations. Gibbs shook with rage and soon stormed out. The rest of the group sat stunned. The conflict, the profanity, the yelling. It's a sort of vivid, if ultimately meaningless, detail that provides books like Renegade, Game Change, and now the Obamas with their lurid and irresistible zing. Such books regard more earnest matters like history, context, and ideas the way a child looks at a plate of Brussels sprouts. They aim to serve up big bowls of ice cream, and no matter what Michelle Obama counsels, we political gluttons will lick the spoon clean. It just, so he's reacting to the book, but I also think it's in this atmosphere of, again, ubiquity and the constant flow of fact and information at all scale, at the most important, but also the most mundane, and what in the end that adds up to. How do you think about that, and how did you think about that when you were working on the book?
Well, the first thing is that, I think where I disagree with Remnick is that that scene had such thematic and emotional resonance to me, because just to back up and describe the context, One of the things that the book describes is that the Obamas want to win at politics, but they kind of hate politics and they don't want to play by its rules. They think it's their critique has a lot of resonance because it's actually the same critique that a lot of us have. And part of what has made them so fascinating to cover is that they don't want to do the usual things the usual ways. But then sometimes you have to do the usual things, the usual ways. You have to watch what you say, or watch the way you appear in public, or politic with certain ethnic groups, or do the rituals that make politicians and take the precautions that make politicians successful. And Gibbs, is in the campaign, the '08 campaign and in the early White House, was often the enforcer of those rules. And he was very brave about it, in a sense, because he was willing to tell the Obamas the things they didn't want to hear. But it was also a difficult role to play, and it made his relationship with Michelle Obama particularly difficult. I'll give you an example. Michelle Obama, when she goes abroad, will often bring a makeup artist or a hair person on Air Force One. And especially the women in the audience can understand why. You're going on these foreign trips, you're on a plane for 7 hours, you have to come down the stairs, everybody photographs you. You, of course, want to look very presentable. And it's not like the first Black First Lady can show up in Stockholm, right? And, go to the first hair salon. But Gibbs would express concerns before a trip saying this is going to be all over the conservative media. You're going to look self-absorbed. You're going to look shallow. Remember that it's all playing into this budget debate. So, oh my God, the Obamas gave a seat on Air Force One to a hair or makeup person, et cetera, et cetera. So there had been this constant, low-level friction, not major explosions in hallways, but this very tense relationship between Gibbs's office and the First Lady's office. And this culminates in this incredibly uncomfortable moment between Valerie Jarrett and Robert Gibbs in a staff meeting where Gibbs just explodes. He loses it and he says, F you, F her about the First Lady who's not present, which is a shocking thing for the White House press secretary to say. And then the other significance of it is this is what the Obama team has come to, the team that everybody said was so unified and together in 2008 and were able to work out their differences in private. And this has been a very factionalized White House with a lot of competing power centers that didn't get along. So to me, that scene has so much meaning. So, for Ramnick or anybody else to just dismiss it as kind of lurid detail, that's just not the way I saw it. What I notice, but on your point about this constant, accumulation of detail and how much of it really has meaning, what fascinates me is the way the White House has tried to use that in their favor and the way they've started to kind of master that. You can read a million Michelle Obama profiles out there about what her favorite guilty pleasure is, food-wise, French fries, about the sports she makes her daughters learn, about a zillion other, does Sasha like tomatoes or not? Or a lot of talk about the dog, a lot of stories about the dog. She'll do these late night appearances and whatnot, where again, it's all about telling these gentle family stories that on the one hand are information rich. They are kind of, what we call color, meaning they're cool details that help animate the story and make it feel alive and immediate. But on the other hand, are not any real information about her or who she is or what she's thinking or her reaction to this administration or how she influences her husband or any of the other important questions that we would want to ask her. And the other thing I notice about that is how eagerly everybody consumes it. I see on social media, I'm on Facebook all the time, and my friends are constantly posting Michelle Obama's endearing appearance from, Jimmy Kimmel's show last night or whatever. And that's fine. She is often hilarious and charming, and I understand why they're posting it. But the journalist in me wants my friends to understand that they're seeing a very calculated White House strategy that it's campaigning without campaigning, it's kind of a charm offensive, and it's this way, the Obamas repeat the same anecdotes about themselves again and again and again. It's like they've meted out, we're going to share this percentage. We already have to share so much of ourselves with the public. We are going to share this much more and no more.
So I just want to pursue that just a little bit more, and then we're going to open it up to questions. But is it not the inevitable an inevitable point on a spectrum that starts with the Nixon Kennedy debates in the CBS studio in Chicago, where the color of the shirt and the quality of the makeup actually play a significant role in the outcome of that. And so the increasingly sophisticated use of each medium, both by journalists but also on the part of the people that we write about, seems to me just an inevitability. And so then, at some place on that spectrum, it is looking great on the Jimmy Kimmel Show, or the president, frankly, going and doing, performing on late night television. It's not just the domain of the First Lady.
I think that's right, but when I think about
Did
that,
you see the president slow jam the news on late night television? I mean,
right, the unspontaneous spontaneity of it all, right? The the thing that I think about is that it's
and that we're, as Remnick says, eating it up. It's the bowl of ice cream. I mean, it's not an echo chamber. There's a response that kind of coverage has.
I think it presents both problems and opportunities for journalists because, on the one hand, as you say, there is this superficiality to it. And also, it's so highly stage managed that it's really a challenge for journalists to push further. But I also think it's an opportunity because the more stage managed and artificial these reputations are, the greater the gap between the real person and the public image. When I started working on this book, what so many of Mrs. Obama's friends in Chicago said, who she had kind of lost touch with, were, your mission is to go out and find the real person and find what's really happening to her. Because the Michelle Obama that's being presented to the public by the White House, or that the version of herself that she is presenting, it's not that it's inauthentic. She's not saying anything fake exactly, but it's so limited and there's so much else there. But then that puts you also in a hard and sometimes very adversarial position with the White House or whoever the political power is of the moment, because they have so much invested. If you look at Mrs. Obama's convention speech, it was such a performance, right? I mean, it was an amazing bit of rhetoric, right? So kind of saying, forget that we're successful, forget that we live in the White House, forget that we actually have a ton of money. Let's talk about our banged up old coffee table and our banged up old car and how we're the ones who sympathize with everyday Americans. And so a question I've thought about in regards to my own career is like, okay, like that's kind of uncomfortable, right? To be the person who's constantly trying to puncture that a little bit.
Is it not possible to be, I mean, because I'm thinking of Mrs. Romney's address or Mr. Clinton's, or is it not possible to embody multiple realities within a candidate?
Oh, yeah, no, I think that's absolutely the goal. But at some point, it becomes really threatening, to these campaigns, and these figures have so much invested in this. And it's amazing how anxious they can get, even when you're not revealing anything particularly terrible. I mean, the way you keep yourself safe in public life now and in politics is to control everything. The person in the Obama campaign who is really the master of this is Stephanie Cutter, who would be fascinating for you to have here someday when this is all over, because to me, she's the person in the Democratic Party who's the foremost practitioner of the politics of reputations. Michelle Obama, Sonia Sotomayor, Timothy Geithner, Ted Kennedy. What she's done for all of these people is kind of protect them in public life by making sure that the most widely appealing aspects of their reputations were kind of put forward, and anything that could be negative or controversial is very much controlled.
I'd like to open it up to questions from people here. Yes.
Okay, so the first thing is I don't know if you've read the book, but so part of what so it's really, you know, the Michelle Obama part of the book is this story about how it's a story of somebody triumphing at something she hated. You know, she never wanted to be in politics, and yet she became so good at it. And one of the ways that she became really good at it is she made a lot of the quote unquote limitations of first ladyhood into protections. What I mean is that she started out as this professional, this Harvard trained lawyer who really chafed at a lot of the, you know, cliches of how you're supposed to be this sort of docile helpmate. Well, a couple of years into her experience in the White House, the thing I really started noticing as a reporter is that some of those old cliches about first ladies, you know, not having strong opinions or not being involved in policy or whatever, those actually became her friend in a lot of ways. And she's very cleverly exploited them, not really exploited them, but used them to protect, you know, I'm not part of the political fray. I'm just the mom in chief. So I think that in a lot of ways, what she's done is very clever, kind of making a system that's not always favorable to women really work for her in some ways. And the second thing is, I want to make a distinction between um, kind of really watching what the Obamas are doing and judging it, because I don't think it's my role to criticize Michelle Obama for, you know, doing the whole mom in chief, or for maybe hiding the parts of her, you know, that could be controversial or could be easily misconstrued in a racist way. But just because her critics are unfair and brutal and even possibly racist doesn't mean that I should stop writing about who I think she really is. And I'm so glad you raised what you raised, because I did think that was a little bit misunderstood when my book came out, that just because I'm trying to write about her in a clear-eyed, penetrating way and get to the real person doesn't mean that I'm saying that her critics are right or that she's doing something bad by operating the way she's operating. Does that distinction make sense?
Jodi, I think there's something else in there, and I'm curious about this too, which is how far we have or haven't progressed from the 2-for-1 Clinton scenario, and I'm not here to bake cookies and all of that. It sometimes seems not at all.
Sometimes it seems not at all, but again, you know, um, Michelle Obama has done subtle things to update the role of First Lady. Like, I'll give you an example. A really hokey thing that First Ladies have to do is before state dinners, they're supposed to like introduce the china and the food. Michelle Obama like doesn't even, I mean, it's kind of funny because even though she's big on healthy eating, she was never a big cook. Like, spending a lot of time in the kitchen was never her thing. And so she's kind of de-emphasized the China thing very gently. And before state dinners, what she'll often do is invite a diverse group of school kids into the White House and use it as kind of an educational event to teach them about, you know, everything from international relations to what it takes to put on an event like that, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of a subtle updating of the role, I think. And then there are times when, you know, again, I think she makes like I think the reason why the role of First Lady is inevitably outdated and behind the role of American women is that first ladies can't work. There's no official rule saying they can't work, but none of them do, because the idea is that the conflicts of interest and the scrutiny would just be too great. It wouldn't be worth it. It would cause too many problems. Although Jill Biden, we should say, still teaches community college. But, you know, and the big thing that's happened to American women over the last decades is that we've entered the workplace. And so not all of us are in the workplace, but we all have the chance, at least, to choose whether we want to be in the workplace or not. And so as long as we have a first lady who's not in the workplace, how contemporary a reflection of American womanhood is she really going to be able to be? There's always going to be that kind of discrepancy. But there are ways in which Michelle Obama has let some people's outdated assumptions about first ladyhood really work for her. And I think a good example is the Let's Move initiative, which is her childhood obesity program. It is sometimes covered in the most condescending way. My own newspaper, which I love, has called it her pet project. And, I think people in the White House must just be smiling at that, because she has taken on one of the toughest, most intractable public health problems there is out there. I mean, it's an almost absurdly ambitious initiative. You're going to change the very existence, of American children, everything they take into their bodies, the way they move around in the world. Childhood obesity is a public health problem that nobody's been able to fix for decades and decades. And yet it is, and also, by the way, she is, in her very politic way, taking on some very big corporate interests. I mean, make no mistake, she wants to get McDonald's and Frito-Lay and, and all of the big companies that make food that's not necessarily so good for kids to change their practices. And yet she's been able to do it in this frame of, okay, everybody, let's do jumping jacks. And this is just a mom thing that's really good for kids, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that in some ways that's the new model of, First Lady action. Laura Bush did the same thing. Laura Bush spoke out very strongly about the Taliban's treatment of women in Afghanistan, which is, about as serious, is unto itself and relates to about the most serious foreign policy challenges we have. And yet she did it in her decorous, quiet, Laura Bush way. She actually took over her husband's weekly radio address one week to talk about this. And I've always wondered, what would happen if Michelle Obama took over the weekly radio address? Would people notice, or would there be an outcry?
Interesting. Other questions? Yeah, June.
Well, so I didn't hear the particular segment, so it's really hard for me to comment on it, but I get your more general question, which is, to what extent do we as journalists have to be cognizant of the fact that some of the opposition to Obama may be based on race, and do we need to recognize that in our reporting? Is that what you're asking? Okay. Absolutely. It's hard to know, God's truth about, the extent to which the opposition to Obama is grounded in race. On the one hand, are there some pretty strong clues that it is? Absolutely. On the other hand, remember that Bill Clinton was, widely called a redneck, white trash, trailer trash guy, et cetera. So there's also the extent to which, the opposition will take any characteristic, or background or ethnicity and kind of run with it. But the thing that I think is so important is looking at the context in which these public figures operate. One of my jobs at the Times is to do these long biographical stories we do in the run-up to an election. They're called The Long Run, and we look back at different chapters of a candidate's life, and those stories are obsessed. They're focused very much on personality and temperament and character and family influences and things like that. But then the thing that I think we also need to focus on is context, and I'm constantly asking myself, about the Obamas. Okay, are they operating, this way because of who they really are and psychological reasons and reasons of their own motivation and ambition or insecurity or whatever? Or are they responding to this very polarized environment, this very extreme environment they're in, and to what extent can we kind of decode their actions by trying to figure out what they're reacting to?
Yeah.
So to the first question, I'm on record as saying that if Michelle Obama ever runs for public office, I will physically eat one copy of my entire book. I really don't think she will do it. I mean, she, as good as she is at campaigning and as successful as she is at as being first lady, she kind of has, aides say her attitude is like she's very conscious of how much time she has left, that she's only going to be in the White House for 4 or 8 years, that she wants to do as much with the role while she's here, but then she's going to be out. I personally think she'll remain hugely prominent, maybe even in certain ways more prominent than she is now after she leaves the White House. But holding public office was really never her thing. The question that I don't know the answer to as a journalist, and the one that I want to continue to explore, is to what extent has her attitude about politics really changed? Because we know that this is somebody who didn't really used to believe that the legislative process could produce good results, and yet she saw her husband pass health care reform, which she really believes in, and a zillion other things. And also she had always held herself at a remove from the political process, kind of insulated herself from it, stayed in Hyde Park, Kenwood, where she lived. And now that she's been in the bullseye of the White House and she knows the lingo and really understands Congress and, has seen all of this stuff as an eyewitness, has her understanding of it shifted? And to your second question, the way I fact checked the book is that I hired an independent fact checker, somebody who had worked at the New Yorker for a long time, to fact check the book, in part because I did some of it myself, but you don't want to do it all yourself because you want somebody who will challenge you a little bit and kind of second guess your information in a good way. And it's also a tremendous amount of work. The real dilemma of fact checking a book like this is the extent to which you're going to show your cards of what you have, because it's a dilemma, because to make sure that you're absolutely right, you need to come pretty clean with people, not only the sources who told you the information initially, but you really need to cross-check what you have with other sources to find out if their versions are different, or anything is off with your account or whatever. And so to do that involves a kind of leap of faith with your sources. It's easier to do at the newspaper, because at the newspaper, you can do it at 5 p.m. on the day before the story is published. And the White House or anybody else would have very little time to leak or pre-spin the information beforehand. With a book, it's really a leap of faith, because there are months that go by between when you fact check and publication. So for me, it was a real lesson in life that the thing you fear happening is never the thing that actually happens. It's something you didn't anticipate. Because my great fear, and as soon as I started accumulating a lot of new information for this book, I had kind of the anxiety, that a reporter has of new information of, oh my God, I'm walking around knowing things about Barack and Michelle Obama and their time in the White House that are not out there, and that it's going to be months and months and months before I can share them. And so my great worry was that when I fact checked, the White House would do a very devious thing and kind of leak and pre-spin, like maybe leak a more innocuous version of the Robert Gibbs blow up, so that it was kind of out there, by the time my book was published. It turns out that's not what they did. They kind of blew up after the book came out. But I still think it was the right thing to do. And also remember that another big incentive is that I have an ongoing relationship with the White House, even after all the drama of the book. I'm still reporting on these people, and there are relationships I have where it's extremely important that my sources um, kind of, had some accurate expectation of what I was going to say before the book was published.
Laura.
So to your first question, it's not inconceivable that Michelle Obama could be appointed to something, like ex-presidents, when there's a crisis, a disaster in Haiti or something, ex-presidents or always being asked to lead, the humanitarian work. And it's not inconceivable that she could do something like that. It's very different from running for elected office because you don't have to campaign and the scrutiny is a lot less. But I think the fascinating question is how she's going to use this power and cultural capital she has, right? I mean, she is a hugely popular first lady, one of the most admired women in the world, not just in the US. And as we discussed, there is this, if we were looking at the stock market, we would say that, there has been like a gap in the market, like a supply and demand problem, right? Because the need, there's been an absence of, these professional Black women, public figures, and she's filled that, and Valerie Jarrett has
Can I
filled
just make
that.
a specific stock market point, which actually I think makes the point, and this was not a figure, and I hadn't seen this before, but you cite in the book a professor who says that an appearance by the First Lady in clothing from a certain store is worth about $14 million in added value to that company.
Exactly.
I,
So
I thought that was fairly remarkable.
it was remarkable, and and also I
Did I get
think
the number right?
I can't, I mean, I can't remember the precise number, but you can look up the Harvard Business Review study, and um, so that goes directly to your question of she has this enormous power, and that she is such a credible and persuasive figure, and so many people admire her, and she can have such influence on people's behavior. So how is she going to decide to use it, and kind of what will be her venue, especially given, when you think about the model of kind of post presidencies and presidential libraries, the bulk of it is always given to the president, and yet this first lady is, well, a lot of first ladies are more popular than her husband, but Michelle Obama is such a large presence on the public stage that I wonder if the usual presidential library model will fit them exactly. In part, one thing that people always said in Chicago, who knew them originally, was that they always thought Michelle Obama was going to be as big as Barack Obama. I can't remember if you were one of the people who had that impression, but lots of people did. And so that's a question about her post presidency as well. In terms of feedback on the book, I have gotten a lot of really good feedback from sources. I've basically said to my sources that I'm interested in any and all serious feedback, that I really want to hear it, and even if they have tough things to say to me, it would be really valuable for me to hear it. The one thing you hear over and over again when writing political stories is that people in politics and campaigns and administrations feel that journalists overly focus on conflict. And this is not unique to me. They're, you know, it's an important thing for us to hear. They're constantly exasperated, right? They're like, okay, um, 93 things went right this month, and then 7 things got really complicated. How come you guys only write about the 7 things that were really complicated? And we say, well, because they were really complicated. And it's this, I'm sure you've had this conversation a
I
hundred or
remember
two.
there was a great quote from Abe Rosenthal about that, which I think sort of put it to rest for all time. He said, "Do you want to read a story in the Times tomorrow that tells you how many planes took off safely from LaGuardia Airport, or do you expect us to tell you about the one that didn't?" I mean, it's a constant complaint.
It's a constant complete, and I do hear and appreciate what the politicos are saying, which is like, essentially, you're not giving us credit for the incredibly difficult things we do that go right. It's totally the right question to ask, because I dealt with it very head on. I took a year and a half leave from the Times to write the book because I was afraid of putting myself in the position that you're in. It was made further complicated by the fact that I hired my editor, Rebecca Corbett, from the paper to work on the book. I really felt I couldn't do the book without her. She and I had been having this years long conversation about the Obamas, and I also knew that I was going to face some reportorially very tricky situation. So, as I mentioned, this White House is very factionalized, or at least the early Obama White House was much more so. And the challenge of being fair to everybody in a really factionalized White House is a very serious one. And book publishers are great, but they're experts in producing books. They're not experts in asking the kinds of questions that Rebecca asks me every day. And I knew I needed that journalistic supervision on the book. And also, it was very important to me that the book kind of conformed to the standards of the New York Times. I wanted it to be, of a piece with my Times work. And so that's the way we did it. And I did go in reporting knowing that if anything really dramatic happened, like a news event, I could be called back to the paper. And that if there was anything I found out in my reporting that we really felt would not hold for publication of the book, Rebecca and I would have a conversation with the editors about whether to put it in the paper. But none of that happened.
I think we have time for one more, Chris.
The president is a very unusual combination of qualities. He's extremely competitive, but not combative. And you don't always find that in people. And there's a great early Michelle Obama quote that I think is in the book. So Michelle and Barack Obama were interviewed in 1995 or 96, right, when the president was first running for office. And we are not getting, Michelle Obama, who's learned to be first lady. We're getting Michelle Obama, who is very young and totally honest in interviews. And she talks about her fears about her husband going into politics. And she says, essentially, that she thinks her husband is too nice a person for politics, that he is very sincere, that he's very earnest. He sees and expects the best in people, that he likes resolution and not conflict. And she's worried that he's going to be torn apart by these jackals in politics. And I think that's a really good note to end on, because that is ultimately one of the best reasons to write about presidential marriages, because wives, and I hope one day husbands of presidents, they know all of their spouse's flaws and weaknesses, right? Nobody has dirt on us like our spouses have dirt on us. And so I love that early Michelle Obama quote, because she's expressing the fear that you've expressed, that a lot of people have expressed about Barack Obama, but she's not doing it as a political adversary. She's not doing it to score points. She's doing it in such an honest way as a concerned wife, saying, I'm really worried that my husband is headed onto dangerous territory, and I'm worried that he's not cut out for it.
If we could just get you to maybe, as a final note, to prognosticate a little bit. So you describe him as competitive but not combative. What are you expecting out of the next debate?
It is a multivariable equation, right? Because we have a Barack Obama who is under unbelievable pressure to deliver a completely different performance. We have a Mitt Romney who will come in confident, knowing that what he did the first time worked, but very alert to the fact that Obama is going to have a change in strategy. And then to add a third element, we have a moderator who knows that Jim Lehrer was absolutely torn apart for what many people felt was a passive performance and not enough original penetrating questions. So a moderator who I would guess would take a very different approach than Lehrer did. And so, so I think it's sort of like, I don't think we can predict, because it's sort of like we're watching a pinball machine, right? Where all three levers are going to be smacking the ball up against each other. I mean, the only thing you can confidently say, right, is that Barack Obama is going to come in with a much more, it's a foreign policy debate, he's going to come in with a much more muscular defense, of his foreign policy. I would be surprised if we didn't hear the name bin Laden many, many times. But it's funny because, the usual pattern is that, people watch the first debate and then it kind of falls off. This second debate is going to be watched very closely.
Well, we'll be watching it here at Lippman House and reading what you have to say about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.